Our guest was in Denver yesterday. We had a significant presence of Denver police and members of the district attorney's office. And I read a hugely interesting story that said, in Colorado, there have been 376 successful prosecutions of people engaged in child, human, sexual slavery. One man was sentenced by the judge to 472 years in jail. I'd like to interview him when he gets out, but I was on my way to Boston. I'm connected to the Red Sox. And Kathleen Kennedy is my great friend in the Kennedy family, because I worked for Bobby, her dad. And Kathleen said, "Can I bring a friend?" I said, "Of course. Our guest is that friend." And I've learned about her. We had dinner with her in Denver Thursday night. She spoke yesterday. And she's here today. And we're lucky. And you'll understand why. And when she's finished with her remarks, we'll have a dialogue. And she'll talk about her book, Trafficking. And at the end, we will discuss how you get copies of that, and I will help work that out. She was born in Cuba. Her father was a minister in the government of Cuba, pre-Batista. Schooled in Switzerland, speaks 4 languages fluently, reads and writes in those languages. She married one of the Sarnoffs. The father was the founder of NBC. So she's had a really interesting life. She has great kids. They're not kids, but they're always your kids. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that she's become my friend. Welcome, please, Conchita Sarnoff.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, faculty, and students. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank not only George Mitrovic, but also the Point Loma University, Nazarene University, and the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. I'm here to talk not only about my book, Trafficking, and I'll explain to you the cover very shortly, but I'm also here to talk to you on behalf of the thousands of children, young girls and young boys who have remained silent and are unable to speak. Human trafficking is the equivalent of modern slavery. It is when a trafficker sells a child, usually under the age of 18, for either sex, labor, organs, or, as it happens many times in Africa, warfare. According to, and these are numbers that I just called, according to the FBI, San Diego is one of the top cities in the United States for human trafficking. And according to the San Diego District Attorney, San Diego has reported at least 8,000 victims this year. That is 8,000 too many. I'm assuming that these numbers are soft because one of the issues that we have is that we do not have, and when I say we, I mean the organizations, the NGOs, the government agencies, the 15 federal agencies who work the field of human trafficking, do not have a central bank metric system in place to be able to garner and cull the numbers, the accurate figures. So whatever figures I give you, just consider them to be soft. I'm going to get right into the heart of the book, and then I will give you numbers because there's just so many numbers, and I don't like to give numbers that might or might not be accurate. Why I came to write this book. I have been working in the field of human trafficking for 11 years, since 2006, when I first went to Mexico. And I was working for Cemex, Cementos Mexicanos, which is the second largest cement company in the world. They had just acquired a small British company called RMC, Ready Mix Concrete. And I was doing their restructuring and integration. In my previous incarnation, I was crisis communications. So I did a lot of crisis work for governments, for corporations, consumer goods, etc. And I worked in Switzerland for 8 years. I worked for a pharmaceutical company, a biotech that was recently acquired by Merck. The name of that company was Serona. So during my work in Mexico at Cemex, the foreign minister under President Fox, Mr. Jorge Castañeda, he is in himself an author of multiple books and very involved in the issue of human trafficking, said to me something that stunned me. And he said, you know, you Americans are real hypocrites. You sell us, you buy our drugs, you sell us illegal weapons, and now you're stealing our children. Well, when I heard that last statement, I was actually rather stunned, but because I was in a formal event, at a formal dinner, I didn't really dare respond to him the way I should have. So I kept my mouth quiet, and I went back home within 48 hours, and it just happened that a friend of mine from college, I went to Columbia University, invited a lady friend of his, and she had just opened a human trafficking organization, Innocence at Risk. And it was through this lady, Deborah Sigmund, who is the executive director of Innocence at Risk, that I first learned and met the first people, federal agents, law enforcement agents, most of them, that were working in the field. And I met a young girl. I met a victim. She was 12 years old at the time. This was January 2006. And when I met this girl, it was as if, I couldn't not become involved. I clearly have never been trafficked, thank goodness. I had never dealt with the issue before. My children, luckily, were fine growing up. So I really there was no association with the issue whatsoever, or at least I thought. But after I met this girl, my whole life changed, and I decided I'm going to take 1 year off, which I can afford to do, and I'm going to investigate this issue. So I go to Mexico to investigate this other case, and I find that there's a woman, a 64-year-old grandmother, who had been extradited to the United States. It was the first case in the United States that was so enormous that it made headlines. And she had 2 sons, Gerardo and Josue Flores, and they are both now serving 50 years in a federal prison. She would have her sons, a cousin and a friend, bring children from different parts of Mexico City to where they lived, in a small town called San Miguel de Tenancingo. And for some reason, San Miguel de Tenancingo attracts or has beautiful children in the town. And so I went to the town to find out why this town was the source of all these children. And I was given a bodyguard. I went to the house. And when I went to the trafficker's home, who was now extradited and in the United States and serving a 10-year-long sentence, I find that the house belonged to DIF. DIF is the equivalent, it's the Mexican equivalent of the Housing, Health and Human Services, HHS. DIF stands for Departamento Integral de Familia, which is a social service organization, government-run, that helps poor people and young families with money and transportation and whatever needs they have. So I was quite stunned that the house of the trafficker had DIF on the outside. And so I called the grandmother's attorney in New York, and I said, did you give me the correct address? I don't seem, there's a government agency now in this house. He said, no, that's the house. So we went in, and I asked for the director. Nobody responded. There were about 15 women, maybe 20. No one responded. I looked at this one woman who I thought looked like the director. I went up to her. She agreed to sit with me. I sat on a desk. And as I began to ask her questions, of course, there were no answers or very limited answers. And within 5 minutes, she said to me, do you see this bell over here? If you ask me one more question, I'm going to ring the bell, and the town people are going to lynch you. Well, you at first don't believe when somebody tells you that. It sort of takes you for a loop, and you don't believe what somebody's saying that. And I didn't believe her, and I continued to ask questions. And the bodyguard who was with me just picked me up from my shoulder. He said, it is time to leave. And so we leave the house. It was on a second story. We leave, we go downstairs, and behind this truck that said Diff, there was a young girl, and her name was Rita, and she starts to call us, and she says to me, you've got to go, because that woman you were speaking to was the director, and they would have lynched you. 2 weeks before I was there, 2 American reporters had been lynched because they were investigating a similar case. So I get back to Mexico, and the minister says to me, you have been pegged. Too many people know you're here already. I've been hearing things, and you've got to go. You've got to pack your bags and get on the next plane to the United States. I did, and I have never returned. And so as I come back home and I now go to Florida, I find myself investigating a similar case. The trafficker's in jail. He was given 10 years. And I go into the prison to interview the trafficker. He's a very little man, very, very thin. He seemed very quiet. You would never suspect that he was a trafficker. And his job was to secure the house where these children were placed in order to have sex with men. And so as I'm interviewing this man, he tells me his story. And one of the things he tells me is that there was an old man in Palm Beach, an American, this is how he described it in Spanish, an old American man in Palm Beach who was trafficking a lot of children. So I took that, made a note of that, and through another visit, because when God wants you to find something, you're going to find it. And I believe that there's a time for everything in life, and when you need to see something and you need to learn something, you will. And so through this other visit with another friend, I find the man. But unfortunately, that man happened to be someone that I knew. And his name is Jeffrey Epstein. He is worth $2 billion. He is a Wall Street hedge fund manager, and he was arrested in 2005. He was only charged with 2 counts of solicitation of prostitution with a minor. He trafficked over 24 children, and he served only 13 months in a county jail in Palm Beach on a work release program where he would leave jail at 6 in the morning, come back at 10 o'clock at night, and then he was under house arrest for 18 months. Had he been an average Caucasian and arrested for the same charges that he was arrested, he would be serving under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is our federal law that prosecutes traffickers, a minimum mandatory of 20 years. He served only 13 months. He did have to register. He is now a registered level 3 sex offender, and he also had to pay restitution. But all his restitutions were capped to what I understand were $150,000, of which, of course, the victim received very little, and the attorneys received most of that money. He hired many attorneys. Some of them, I'm sure you will know their names, Roy Black, Professor Alan Dershowitz from Harvard University, who was also implicated in the case, and according to one victim, Virginia Louise Roberts, she claims that she was forced to have sex with Professor Dershowitz 6 times. And that case was brought to light on December 31st, 2014, by a reporter in Washington named Josh Gerstein from Politico, which is an Inside the Beltway online journal. And Mr. Gerstein published the report, which exploded on January 1st, as you can imagine. And Mr. Dershowitz went on every newspaper, New York Times, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, claiming his innocence. The interesting thing is that months later, he settled the case. And he paid the attorneys who represented the victim. Now, I'm not saying he is guilty, but the question is, if he was innocent, why did he want to settle the case? And why did he pay the attorneys? At first he said that he would take the victim, quote, under the bus. And he also claimed that he would make sure that both the attorneys who represented the victim, Judge Paul Cassell from from Utah, the University of Utah, and Brad Edwards from Florida, South Florida, that he would make sure that they were disbarred. They were never disbarred. As a matter of fact, they're continuing to represent victims. There are 2 pending cases. This is the longest running human trafficking case in U.S. legal history. Mr. Epstein was arrested in 2005. He is back in court. There is a case in New York of a South African girl who was trafficked when she was 14. She was found at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York. She was taken to Mr. Epstein's mansion in New York. He has the largest triplex in Manhattan off 5th Avenue and 71st Street. And she was obviously raped and made to have sexual relations with him. And so she is now suing Mr. Epstein and suing multiple procurers. That case is pending, and the trial is set for December 5th. There's also another case pending in Florida, which is Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2 versus the United States government. We shall see what happens then. As in most of the cases with Mr. Epstein, they always settle at the 11th hour. And the ones who usually win are, of course, the attorneys, because they're the ones who make the most amount of money. The victims only get a percentage. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what's going on with New York with Mr. Harvey Weinstein, Hollywood producer, but now there has been a nexus. Mr. Weinstein has been charged, and the reason I'm segueing here is because I want you to have a picture of the environment that we're living in now. Mr. Weinstein and of one of the attorneys who represented one of the victims, Virginia Louise Roberts, is the same attorney who represented Mr. Weinstein. David Boies, who also represented Vice President Gore during the Bush-Gore election in 2000, represented Mr. Weinstein, and he represented the victim, Virginia Louise Roberts, pro bono, which means for free. Why did he represent the victim? You need to understand the relationships between Mr. David Boies, the Clintons. Former President Bill Clinton was also implicated in the Epstein case. He was, according to the same victim, Virginia Louise Roberts, he was identified on the island, the United States Virgin Island, which where Mr. Epstein has a home, and where, according to this girl, Virginia Louise Roberts, Mr. President Clinton was there with 2 underage girls, and Mr. Epstein and Miss Maxwell. So Mr. Boies represents Miss Roberts. He represents her in 2015, September 2015. Within a year, it's our presidential elections. The Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., was also the office that registered Mr. Epstein. According to Judge Ruth Pickles from New York, when the DA's office represented Epstein at the registration, they asked for a level 1 registration, which is the least dangerous registration a sexual predator can have. I understand that in Colorado and perhaps even in California, and I'm not quite sure, so you could look this up, there are no designations. I think you're just simply designated a sex offender, but there are no categories 1, 2, and 3. In New York, you have categories, the least dangerous to the most dangerous, 1 through 3. And according to the judge who I spoke to personally, she said to me, the DA's office had come to my registration hearing and had asked for a young army man who had a relationship with a girl who pretended to be 21 because he met her at a bar and she was drinking and she had lied about her age. And after he had this relationship with a girl, her parents found out and they filed a police report, and the young army boy was sadly discharged, arrested, bless you, and served a year in jail. And of course he had to register in New York, and the DA's office asked for a level 3 registration for the boy. The judge refused to give him a level 3 registration. 2 weeks later, she gave him a level 1. 2 weeks later, the same DA's office comes into the hearing and asks for a level 1 registration for Mr. Epstein, and she refuses. She says, no, I've read the case history, I've seen the number of girls, and he deserves to be a level 3. The Manhattan DA appealed her decision. She was reaffirmed, so Mr. Epstein is a level 3. So all of this goes to show that this case is so political, because if money was not involved, if Mr. Epstein was not worth those $2 billion, the defense would have gone in a very different direction. And what I'd like to do now, if you don't mind, I'd like to read you a very brief paragraph of the letter that the district attorney, that the prosecutor wrote to me when I published the story in the Daily Beast. I broke the story 2010 in the Daily Beast. And I showed the prosecutor a letter that a source had given me from his office to Mr. Epstein's attorney who represented him. And he wrote, his name is R. Alex Acosta, and he is today the Labor Secretary of the United States under President Trump. March 20th, 2011, to whom it may concern. I served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida from 2005 to 2009. Over the past weeks, I have read much regarding Mr. Jeffrey Epstein. Some appears true, some appears distorted. I thought it appropriate to provide some background with 2 caveats. 1, under Justice Department guidelines, I cannot discuss privileged internal communications among department attorneys. And 2, I no longer have access to the original documents, and as the matter is now nearly 4 years old, the precision of memory is reduced. The Epstein matter was originally presented to the Palm Beach County State Attorney. Palm Beach police alleged that Epstein unlawfully hired underage high school females to provide him sexually lewd and erotic massages. Police sought felony charges that would have resulted in a term of imprisonment. According to press reports, however, in 2006, the state attorney, in part due to concerns regarding the quality of the evidence, agreed to charge Epstein only with 1 count of aggravated assault with no intent to commit a felony. That charge would have resulted in no jail time, no requirement to register as a sexual offender, and no restitution for the victims. Local police were dissatisfied with the state attorney's conclusions and requested a federal investigation. Federal authorities received the state's evidence and engaged in additional investigation. That was 2 years. Prosecutors weighed the quality of the evidence and the likelihood for success at trial. With a federal case, there were 2 additional considerations. First, a federal criminal prosecution requires that the crime be more than local. It must have an interstate nexus. Second, as the matter was initially charged by the state, the federal responsibility is to some extent to backstop state authorities to ensure that there is no miscarriage of justice, and not to also prosecute federally that which has already been charged at the state level. After considering the quality of evidence and the additional considerations, prosecutors concluded that the state charge was insufficient. In early summer 2007, the prosecutors and agents in the case met with Epstein's attorneys. Roy Black. Mr. Black is perhaps best known for his successful defense of William Kennedy Smith's trial. The prosecutors presented Epstein a choice: to plead guilty to a more serious state felony charge, which would result in 2 years imprisonment, registration as a sex offender, and restitution for the victims, or else prepare for a federal felony trial. This is the important part. What followed was a year-long assault on the prosecution and the prosecutors. I use the word assault intentionally, as the defense in this case was more aggressive than any which I or the prosecutors in my office have previously encountered. Mr. Epstein hired an army of legal superstars: Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, former judge and then Pepperdine Law Dean Ken Starr, former deputy assistant to the president and then Kirkland Ellis partner Jay Lefkowitz, and many others, including prosecutors who had formerly worked in the United States Attorney's Office and in the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section of the Justice Department. Defense attorneys next requested a meeting with me to challenge the prosecution and the terms previously presented by the prosecutors in their meeting with Mr. Black. I'm going to leave it here, but I'm going to say that after a 2-year investigation, Mr. Acosta, our labor secretary, was pressured into giving Mr. Epstein a non-prosecution agreement. Unheard of in any case where there is human trafficking involved or the rape of a child under the age of 18. Mr. Acosta went on to become dean of the FIU Law School, and he is now serving under the Trump administration. Mr. Epstein is now free. 2 pending cases, which I'm sure he will settle. Multiple newspapers in New York are consistently photographing him with young girls in the front steps of his door, and they have done absolutely nothing to start a new investigation. The district attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., has received multiple letters, some of them from me, with photographs asking why they don't open a new investigation. Oddly enough, he has also been receiving money from David Boies, the same attorney who represented the young girl, Virginia Louise Roberts. And he has been receiving money from Mr. Weinstein, the same man who he refused to prosecute in 2015 on sexual harassment charges. So I leave it to you to decide why cases such as trafficking, and I will explain to you why I chose this coverage shortly, become so important, because they set precedent in our country. You see, many traffickers after Epstein in the state of Florida have used Mr. Epstein's defense as an excuse to get off. And by using Mr. Epstein's case, There is now precedent. Why should Joe Smith, who's worth only $100,000, go to jail for 20 years when he only trafficked one child? While Mr. Epstein, who according to hundreds of depositions, not 10, but hundreds of depositions, trafficked more than 24. The case that Mr. Mitrovic mentioned about the man who received 400 years. It doesn't, the numbers don't add up. So I think that the important thing to know about this case is that it was clearly not fair. It was not fair, most of all, to the victims, who were given very little restitution, and there are now more victims who are definitely not safe. Because with money, you can clearly buy the very best counsel there is, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you can buy the very best counsel there is, it means that you might not be able to have the type of justice that we need in order to put these type of men behind bars, or women. There are a lot of women who have become traffickers, sadly. So this is not just a male crime. Women and men today are trafficking children all over the world. And so it leads me back to my multiple investigations and to the great good fortune I had one year when I met a Border Patrol agent and I was investigating why so many children are coming in from Mexico. And he took me to the border, one of the many borders that we have, and they showed me what they call rape trees. And these are 3 to 4 foot tall, leafless trees. They're about this high. And from afar, or from the air, they look like just, dead branches, brush, with plastic bags. And as you approach them, what these little white and colored looking things are children's undergarments. Because traffickers from Mexico bring children in through these borders, they walk them through, and they gang rape the children at these points in order to break them. And then they hang their undergarments to tell the American counterpart that that specific area where they are is safe and that the children are there and have been raped. And that's what these trees, that's why they call them rape trees. So I have attended raids. I have seen things that I don't think many of you would like to ever see. And I believe that the reason I have done this, and I continue to do this, is because it's a calling, I think. And because I would not want this to happen to my children or anyone else's children. And I think there is a grave need for every single person in this room to do something to stop human trafficking. We're living in 2017. Slavery should have ended when President Lincoln created a law against slavery. It exists today. And it does not exist in the form of labor or African males being brought from Africa to work in the South in the cotton fields and tobacco fields. Sadly, now exists online, where traffickers are recruiting our children online. And according to the International Labor Organization, 22 million children are trafficked worldwide. That is too many. And they're being trafficked online, chatted up online. And by the way, the monies that are being made by the trafficking of children are going into banks and offshore companies. What's up with that? I mean, where is that money going? And why aren't we doing something to freeze those assets? Because that money can help our law enforcement protect the victims. We have 3 pillars in the field of human trafficking that we live by: prevention, protection, and prosecution. And we need money to help the children survive. And once these children are rescued, we also need safe houses. I run an organization in Washington, D.C., Alliance to Rescue Victims of Trafficking, where Kathleen is a board member. And we have a bipartisan board, and our main focus is to raise awareness of human trafficking. We are now working with American University as well. We're looking to build a center of human trafficking research and clinic. And the fight will continue. As long as there is a trafficked victim, we are going to be here fighting that crime. So I thank you all so very much for coming, for listening, and I hope you all get involved. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have time for dialogue if there. Mr. Hess.
Could you tell us more about the work of Alliance and
Certainly.
what you do and how you
Certainly.
go about it?
Certainly.
You might want to repeat the question.
Yes. So Mr. Hess asked what at Alliance to Rescue Victims of Trafficking do we do? And we do multiple things. We research the issue. We raise awareness of the issue. We create events and activities and fundraisers to raise awareness of the issues. We have now joined forces. I teach at American University. I'm now teaching a course beginning in the winter called Human Trafficking in Global Society. It's a graduate level course. And we're now going to join American University to open a Center for Human Trafficking Research and a clinic. So those are just a few of the things. I've also, and some of our board members, one of them is Miss Paula Dobriansky, who, as you might know, was the Undersecretary of State under Condoleezza Rice. So, and Miss Kathleen Kennedy, who was Lieutenant Governor of the state of Maryland. We have a number of ambassadors, the ambassador from Peru now to Japan, who was the former ambassador to the United States, the ambassador of Paraguay, the ambassador of Costa Rica, the ambassador of the United States to Venezuela, Mr. Larry Leibowitz, who was the chief operating officer of the New York Stock Exchange, and several others.
Sue,
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
you should repeat them.
Yes.
Can you be more specific about what we here in this room can do other than joining the Alliance, which I think is the start? But
Thank you.
if you have any other suggestions, I know
Absolutely.
the state of California is doing more than they used to.
Yes.
But if we want to lobby our elected representatives,
Yes.
exactly what do we need to say?
Yes.
The other question is that house in Mexico.
Yes.
Why can't we shut that down?
Well, we have no jurisdiction to shut down a house in a sovereign
but
country.
why can't we make them shut it down?
Ah. Well.
No leverage or?
I think the simple answer to that is we have no leverage. Well, certainly now we have less leverage with Mexico. But I'm going to answer your first question, which is what can you do to help our organization? First of all, you could speak at your church. You could speak with your friends. You could speak to the legislature, to your congressman, to your representative. You can write a letter. You know, the numbers, even though they are soft, as I mentioned earlier, the numbers can be researched online, and you can write that. You know, government officials like numbers. So you write a letter stating, in my hometown of San Diego, there are X many trafficked children. What are you doing about it? We need safe houses. One of our goals, that I forgot to mention, sir, is that one of our goals at Alliance to Rescue Victims of Trafficking is to open a safe house. Washington, D.C. does not have a safe house for children. Where do these children go if they manage to escape their traffickers? They need a bed, they need a shelter, and if you don't have that, to give them that. There are many organizations such as Polaris that offer a number, a toll-free number, what they call a hotline number, but that means that the victim has to have a cell phone in order to call the hotline number, and in order for her then to be transferred to another organization that might be able to keep her overnight. If she goes to the police cannot hold a victim, cannot protect a victim. They can hold her, take down the information as to who trafficked her and where and when and how, but they can't hold her in a cell interminably and protect her. They have to release her on the street. And what happens to that child, boy or girl, once they're released? Chances are they're going to be picked up again. So many children, if they're not addicted to drugs, which is another issue with in this field, because many of them are immediately given opioids, meth, crack, cocaine, heroin. They are addicted and then dependent on their trafficker to supply that drug. So the children need beds. We're looking to open a safe house. I find it challenging to receive funding from government for a safe house. First of all, they don't fund bricks and mortar. They fund programs, but not homes. And there have been many safe houses across the country who have been shut down because one or two victims escaped the safe house. And then the government pulled its money and they had to shut down. So you have to be careful when you receive government funding that you abide by all the regulations, of course. So what you can do is write the letters, get involved, talk about it in church, spread the word, raise awareness however you can, a bake sale, write about it, write an opinion letter in the newspaper, and try to help those organizations, and there are many. The thing is, we need a data bank. We need a central depository where all these numbers and information and statistics can be pulled and used by the federal government and by the federal agencies to really prevent and protect the victims. And hopefully, and I know Microsoft is now working hard to create tools, as is wearethorn.org, which belongs to Ashton Kutcher. His organization, I know, creates tech tools that are given for free to law enforcement. And we need more of those. But we have hundreds of small organizations. We now need to centralize and come together and create something that really changes. If we can't measure the problem, we cannot change the problem. Yes?
I just want to make a comment that in San Diego we have 28 beds for victims of human trafficking, but 0 of them are for children. We cannot take any children under the age of 18 in any of our rescue homes in San Diego because of a group home.
Kim, come and say that
Okay.
so we can get you on tape.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No.
Wasn't meaning to get in front of the mic. So we have about 28 beds in San Diego right now for victims, but none of them are for children under the age of 18. There's a special legislation around group homes and housing children in the state of California, and so it's very difficult to get a group home or a home for minors approved. There are several organizations in our region who are trying to open homes for children, but currently there are 0. So what that means is, if a child is rescued, intercepted by the police, or is looking for help, they go into the foster care system, which is the most vulnerable place for a child. And then they typically run away from that. And a runaway has 48 hours before they're going to be approached by a pimp. So it's a real problem. I mean, like you said, Conchita, our numbers are about 3,400 to 8,000 victims at any given time, we believe, are here in San Diego. Those numbers actually came out of a research study that we did here at Point Loma. Yeah, but we only when you look at that number, we only the law enforcement interacts with about 100 victims a year, and I didn't know you were here. And we only have we have a real deficit of beds right now.
And can I follow up with what Kim said concerning the foster care, because I was going to say that at the beginning, but I think this is the most appropriate time. The most recent Pew census claims there are 500,000 children in the foster care system today. 70% of inmates in prison come from the foster care system. 80% of inmates on death row have been exposed to, at one time or another, to the foster care system. 50% of kids in foster care will not graduate high school, and 95% of kids will not get a college degree. Foster care children are 4 times more likely to be exposed to human trafficking than non-foster care children. It is a breeding ground and has become, foster care, a pipeline for traffickers. Yes?
Eddie?
Thank you. What initiatives in prosecuting the offenders, what's at the leading edge there, and what's happening, and what can we hope for on that end? I know you're focusing on the victims, but
what initiatives on the prosecution side, you said?
right, as far as the offenders going after the perpetrators,
Right.
is there anything on the horizon? What's the state of the enforcement?
Okay,
Are
so
there issues there? What are the issues
well,
there?
we have a federal law, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which if you commit a federal crime, such as the Epstein case, there was clearly a federal crime because he abused girls not only from the state of Florida when he was in Palm Beach, Florida. He was accused by several victims of abusing children in New York, in the United States Virgin Islands, in his ranch in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So, and because there was an online nexus, everything that happens online automatically is interstate. So it becomes a federal crime versus a state crime. So we have one federal law, TVPA, which has been reauthorized since the law was enacted in 2000. We have multiple state laws, statutory rape. So it depends how the government wants to handle the case. I have heard of multiple cases where they do not want to use the federal law. And they decide, the Deputy District Attorney of Los Angeles, Janet Creighton, and I have had several conversations about this, and she explained at one time that sometimes it's best for the prosecution to apply state law, and that way they can get more time in jail than the federal TVPA. I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I can't get into the legal explanations too profoundly because I would be doing a great disservice. But there are state laws and there are federal laws, and that one federal law, TVPA, prosecutes traffickers, and the minimum mandatory is 20 years.
Dr. Braun?
Sometimes when you look at a morbidity statistic, you look for a key item that will discern a handle on a problem. And if you listen to this, the first thing that would come to mind would be the rescue of a young girl who was drug addicted and one who wasn't. I mean, that would be a critical figure that I would say, look, how many of these people that are rescued are drug addicted when you get them? Because I think that group is going to be a real hard nut.
I agree with you. I don't have the numbers as to whether how many. I have not found the numbers anywhere as to how many children come in addicted to drugs who have been trafficked versus children who have been trafficked who are not addicted to drugs. I know a lot of women who are working through AA and other Narcotics Anonymous and other organizations who are dealing with trafficked children who are addicted to drugs. But I can't give you a number. Now, you're absolutely right. It is far more difficult to rehabilitate a child who is addicted to drugs because the first point of rehabilitation has to be the drug and then the trauma. The problem with that, I believe, is also coupled with that, the child, the younger the child, the easier it is to rehabilitate the child. Once your hormones kick in at 13, 14, it is quite normal to want to experiment sexually. So if a child is trafficked at 8, where the hormones are still, at an 8-year-old level, where there's no sexual experimentation wanted by that child, it's going to be easier to rehabilitate an 8-year-old than it would be to rehabilitate a 15-year-old who will already have had, clearly a hormone change in her body. So after speaking to many, many therapists, and we have one very prominent therapist on our board, Dr. Rivas Vasquez from the state of Florida, it is clear that it is a child upon receiving a trauma, any trauma, especially this type of trauma, shuts down automatically. It's very difficult to interview a child during the very early stages, during the first few days, because a child remembers only a few things, not the entire episode. And it's just a form of our own personal mind, our mechanism to protect us. The mind protects itself, and it does that by creating a sort of amnesia as to what happened. It takes a while for the child to remember more detailed information about the trauma. So rehabilitation is very, very difficult. It takes a very, very long time. It could take years, and sometimes they never are rehabilitated fully. Yes?
First, I want to ask any student questions from... Okay. Yes.
I just want to follow up on that. So, what you do is you're talking about statistics, and of course that's the most important thing in
Yes.
mass decision
Yes.
making policies.
Absolutely.
That thing. So, you want a profile of these individual people.
Yes.
And without any help from the government, or without any help, who's always coming to help you, as you know, without that, you can still take each individual child and start with these certain morbidity parameters, where there are factors that make it more difficult or easier. So, are they on drugs is one. What is the age of the child? So anything that you can get information from that child and put into your own data bank. I mean, this can be done by, a high school junior with more television, with more
Right.
computer smarts than I have, and that will help you at the end of a
Thank
period
you.
of time when you have
Yes.
measurable quantities, because your research sources are always going to be limited, and decisions will have to be made. Okay, now we've literally, quote, rescued them, but the next step is the trip that's really important also, and that's going to be determined by those statistics.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that is one of the issues that we would like to bring up at American University now that we're joining forces with them. That is definitely one of our goals, to provide and to access and to have better research across the board on all the issues that impact children survivors.
On the book, if you would like to get a copy of the book, I invite you to email me at the City Club, which is cityclubsd@gmail.com, and I will arrange with Conchita for you to have a copy. And I will be one of those signing up for a copy. Some of us here grew up at a time when there was a popular radio show called The Shadow. And the line from The Shadow was, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows." And Conchita Sarnoff knows. And now so do we. Thank you for coming.